Let the night settle around you. Pull the blanket a little closer. Feel the weight of it against your shoulders, the softness of the pillow beneath your head. The room is quiet, and somewhere outside, the world has grown still and dark. Tonight, that darkness is exactly where we are going. Not into fear, not into cold, but into something older and stranger and more deeply human than you might expect. Because tonight, we are going back to a time when darkness was not a metaphor, when night was not simply the absence of artificial light, but something real and total and physical, a presence that pressed itself against the walls of every home in Europe every single evening for centuries. We are going back to the Middle Ages, and we are going to talk about fire, but not the fire you are thinking of. Not the dramatic fire of battles or execution or dragon mythology. The quiet fire. The ordinary fire. The fire that burned in the center of a room while a family slept around it. The fire that a woman coaxed back to life each morning with careful breath and steady hands. The fire that a village covered each night at the sound of a bell. The fire that was, quite simply, the axis around which medieval life turned. Here is the hidden truth at the heart of tonight's story. We call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. We say it with a kind of comfortable authority, as if darkness were a verdict. But what most people mean when they say that is intellectual darkness, stagnation, superstition, a civilization waiting to be rescued by the Renaissance. And I want to set that aside because there is a much more literal truth hiding inside that phrase. The Middle Ages were dark because after sundown, they were genuinely, physically, completely dark. There were no street lamps. There were no gas lights. There was no electricity flickering on at the flip of a switch. When the sun went down in a medieval village, the darkness that came was not the soft amber glow we call nighttime. It was black. It was the kind of dark that makes the ground disappear beneath your feet, that turns a familiar road into something unknown and dangerous, that makes the distance between your house and your neighbor's house feel like an enormous and uncertain gulf. And in that darkness, fire was not a comfort. It was not a lifestyle choice. It was not ambience. It was the only thing standing between a human being and the full weight of the night. That is what tonight's story is really about. Not fire as spectacle. Fire as survival. Fire as time. Fire as identity. Because in the medieval world, fire organized everything. When you woke and when you slept, what you ate, how warm you were, how safe you felt, how much you could see, how long your evening lasted, what you could afford, and what your neighbors thought of you. And the people who tended fire, who kept it alive, who carried it, who guarded it through the night, were often the most invisible people in the room. Tonight, we are going to follow that fire through every corner of medieval life. We will begin at the very beginning, the almost unbearable difficulty of making a fire from nothing, and the ingenious system medieval people developed to make sure they almost never had to. We will move into the great smoky halls of early medieval homes, where lords and servants slept side by side around a central hearth, and where the architecture of fire was also, quietly, the architecture of power. We will follow the light into the candles and discover that in medieval Europe, what kind of candle burned in your home said everything about who you were. Tallow or beeswax, smoke or sweetness, the fat of animals or the labor of bees. These were not just practical distinctions, they were social ones. We will walk into the darkness itself, the medieval night, where the fear of what moved in the unlit streets was not merely superstition, but a rational response to genuine danger. We will discover the night watchmen who walked those streets with lanterns, and the curfew bell that called every household to cover its fire and go to bed. We will stand inside the great cathedrals, where hundreds of candles burned all at once, and where for many medieval people, the church was the only place they ever saw beeswax light, clean, steady, fragrant, and holy. And we will witness what happened when the fire that sustained life became the fire that ended it. The great medieval urban fires that consumed entire cities in a single night, and what those disasters reveal about how completely and how dangerously fire was woven into the fabric of medieval existence. This is a story about warmth and about fear, about ritual and about survival, about the ordinary objects, the bellows, the tinderbox, the clay fire cover, the tallow candle that shaped the rhythm of every single day for hundreds of millions of people across centuries. And it is, at its heart, a story about what it means to tend a flame, to protect something small and essential from the wind and the dark and the cold, to wake each morning and make sure it is still there. If you have found your way to Dreamy Ages and this is your first time here, I am so glad you've arrived. Please subscribe and settle in, because there are many more nights like this one waiting for you. Now, let us begin in the dark. Let us begin at the moment before the fire, the moment of cold stone floors and gray morning air, when a medieval household stirred into consciousness and the first task of every single day began. Picture a morning in rural England, perhaps the 12th century, perhaps the 13th. The season does not yet matter. What matters is the moment. The interior of a small timber-framed house, one room, walls of wattle and daub, a floor of packed earth. The smell of sleeping bodies, of straw, of the faint animal warmth of a goat or a pig on the other side of a wooden partition. And in the center of the room, a raised stone hearth, or perhaps simply a shallow pit in the earthen floor. And in that hearth, embers. Not fire, not flame, just embers. A small constellation of orange and red tucked beneath a layer of ash, still breathing, still alive. This is the most important thing in the house. More important than anything stored in the wooden chest against the wall. More important than the tools hanging near the door. Those embers represent hours of careful work, days of accumulated skill, and something that the medieval household understood with a clarity we have entirely lost. The knowledge that making fire from nothing is one of the hardest things a human being can do with bare hands and basic materials. We tend to imagine that our ancestors could just rub two sticks together and produce a flame. We carry this idea in our heads like folklore, a comfortable mythology about primitive competence. But the reality was far more difficult and far more interesting. The medieval method for producing fire from scratch relied on a tool called a fire steel, a curved piece of hardened steel struck sharply against a flint stone to produce a spark. That spark had to land on a carefully prepared piece of tinder, charred cloth, dried fungus, powdered bark, fine plant fiber, any of several materials that could catch a spark and hold it as a smoldering ember rather than letting it die immediately. If the spark caught, you had a glow. A tiny, fragile, orange point of heat, no bigger than a thumbnail. You then had to breathe on it with extreme care. Too little and it died, too much and it scattered, while feeding it the most delicate possible fuel, a pinch of fine dried grass, a curl of birch bark, a feather of thistledown. And if that held, if that first fragile flame appeared, and you had dry kindling ready, and you did everything right, you had a fire. The whole process, done with skill and good materials, might take 10 minutes. Done poorly, or with damp tinder, or in cold, uncertain morning air, it could take much longer, or fail entirely. And this is the part that changes everything when you understand it. Medieval people did not usually make fire. They kept it. They maintained it. They transferred it, carried it, protected it, coaxed it, rationed it, and almost never let it go entirely cold. Because a fire that was already burning, even a fire reduced to a few stubborn embers, buried under a night's worth of ash, was not a fire you had to make. It was a fire you could wake. You could take a handful of dry straw and lay it gently over those embers. You could lean close and breathe slowly in a long, low stream of warm air. And within a minute, sometimes less, the ember would redden, the straw would catch, and the morning fire would be alive again. This is what medieval households were actually managing every single day. Not the drama of ignition, the discipline of continuity. And when the fire did go out, when the embers died in the night, when rain came through a broken roof, when illness meant no one had tended the hearth through the dark hours, the solution was not to start from scratch alone. The solution was to go next door. Imagine a woman in that same medieval village, stepping out of her door in the gray light of early morning, carrying a small clay pot or a metal lantern, making her way to the house of a neighbor. She does not knock with urgency. This is not an emergency. This is ordinary life. She knocks and she asks, in the practical, neighborly language of people who depend on each other for the most basic things, if she might take a light, a coal, a burning brand, something alive from their hearth to carry back to her own. This was common enough that it required no explanation and carried no shame. Fire was a shared resource. It moved between households the way water moved, the way salt moved, as a matter of everyday cooperation. And this reveals something that we have, I think, almost entirely lost. Something that the medieval relationship with fire makes visible in a way that nothing else quite does. In a world where making fire from nothing was slow, uncertain, and sometimes impossible, the fire in your hearth was not entirely yours. It came, eventually, from somewhere. It had a lineage. Your neighbor's fire came from the blacksmith's fire, and the blacksmith's fire had been kept by his father, and his father had lit it from the fire of the house beside the mill, and so on, backward into a history of warmth that no one had ever written down, but everyone understood. The fire in your home was a living thing with ancestors. And your job, your daily, unending, unglamorous, essential job, was to make sure it did not die on your watch. This is the world we are stepping into tonight. A world organized not by clocks, not by schedules, not by the rhythm of digital notifications, but by the rhythm of combustion. By the question that began every single day, is the fire still burning? And now we can go deeper. Because in that world organized by fire, the place where the fire lived, the hearth, was not just a feature of the house. It was the house. It was the center of gravity around which everything else arranged itself. And the story of how the hearth changed across the medieval centuries is also, quietly, the story of how medieval society itself changed. How it divided, how it separated, how warmth became a privilege and light became a statement, and the simple act of heating a room became one of the clearest signals of who you were and where you stood in the world. But to understand that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the great smoky hall, to the long evening fire, to the moment before the chimney changed everything. Because what came before the chimney was something remarkable, something communal and intimate, and in its own strange way, more equal than anything that came after. The earliest medieval halls, the great communal spaces of Anglo-Saxon England and early Norman Europe, were heated by a single central hearth, not a fireplace built into a wall, not a chimney directing smoke upward and away, a fire in the middle of the floor, a ring of stones or a raised platform of packed earth, and in the center of it, fire. And above it, nothing but a smoke hole in the roof, an opening through the thatch that let some of the smoke drift upward and out, while the rest of it drifted upward into the upper reaches of the hall, thickening the air, blackening the beams, settling into the fabric of every piece of clothing, every piece of food, every breath taken indoors. Modern researchers, as part of historical reconstructions, have actually spent time inside accurately reproduced Viking and early medieval halls with central hearth fires burning. The results were striking. Even non-smokers, after just a week of this exposure, showed measurable stress on their respiratory systems. The air was not comfortable. The eyes watered. The throat tightened. The smoke was a constant, inescapable presence in every waking and sleeping hour. And yet this was the world people lived in, willingly, across multiple centuries. Not because they were ignorant of the discomfort, but because the hearth offered something that mattered more than comfort. It offered center. Around the central hearth, the entire household gathered. Lord and servant, family and laborer, human and animal in the coldest months, all arranged in concentric circles of proximity to the flame. Those closest to the fire were warmest and most honored. Those at the edges were colder, more peripheral. The hearth was a physical map of social hierarchy, but it was also something else. It was the only light in the room. After dark, once the gray winter afternoon had collapsed into full night, the fire in the center of the hall was the only source of illumination for everyone in that building. There were no candles burning in separate rooms, because there were no separate rooms. There was the hall and there was the fire, and in its flickering orange light, the household existed as a single collective body, eating, talking, doing small tasks, telling stories, praying, and eventually lying down on straw pallets or wooden benches ranged around the walls, pulling cloaks and rough blankets over themselves, and sleeping in the warmth of the shared flame. This is the image I want you to hold for a moment. Not the medieval world of cold stone castles and isolated towers that we tend to imagine, but a hall full of people, breathing the same smoky air, warmed by the same fire, existing together in a way that was, in its own strange fashion, intensely communal. The fire did not belong to anyone. It belonged to the room. And everyone in the room belonged in some sense to each other. This began to change in the 11th and 12th centuries with one of the most consequential architectural innovations of the medieval period. An innovation so ordinary, so practical, so unflashy that it rarely gets the historical credit it deserves. The chimney. A flue built into a wall, a dedicated passage for smoke to travel upward and exit the building away from the people inside. The fireplace moved from the center of the room to the edge, set into a wall, with a proper chimney above it. And this single change, this redirection of smoke, reorganized medieval life in ways that its inventors may not have fully anticipated. When the fire moved to the wall, rooms became possible. Not just one great hall, but several chambers, each with its own fireplace, each with its own source of warmth and light. And suddenly, for those who could afford it, the household no longer had to exist as a single shared body around a communal flame. Different people could be in different rooms. The lord and lady could retreat to a private solar, a separate chamber with its own fire, away from the noise and smell and crowd of the hall. Servants could be assigned to lower rooms, colder rooms, rooms with smaller hearths or no hearths at all. The social hierarchy that had once been inscribed in the simple geometry of who sat closest to the center fire was now written in stone and wood and mortar, in the architecture of the house itself. The historian who has studied this most carefully noted something that I find quietly devastating. The chimney, he wrote, transformed the medieval house from a residence into a tool, an instrument for making social distinctions visible and permanent. Before the chimney, warmth was shared, however unequally. After it, warmth was private. And that privacy was, from the very beginning, a privilege. The peasant family in their one-room cottage continued to gather around their central hearth, sleeping together in the smoky warmth, just as their ancestors had done. The noble family in their newly renovated manor house withdrew into chambers, each one heated, each one separated, each one a small declaration of status. The chimney did not just change where the smoke went. It changed who slept near whom. And in the medieval world, that was not a small thing. That was everything. This transformation of the hearth from communal center to private statement would continue to evolve across the medieval centuries. And it would connect in ways both beautiful and painful to the story of light. Because fire and light were not separate things in the medieval household. They were the same thing, expressed differently. The hearth gave warmth, the candle gave sight, and just as the chimney had sorted medieval people by where they slept in relation to warmth, the candle would sort them by the quality of light in which they worked and prayed and read and moved through the world. That is where we are headed next. Into the candle. Into the two worlds of medieval light, the world of tallow and the world of beeswax, and into what those two worlds reveal about who was seen and who was not, and what it cost, in the Middle Ages, simply to see. The candle seems like such a simple thing. Wax and wick. A small flame. Something we use today for atmosphere, for birthday cakes, for the brief romantic theater of a dinner table. But in the medieval world, a candle was not decoration. A candle was a decision, a calculation, a daily negotiation between what you needed and what you could afford. And the kind of candle that burned in your home said something about you that was immediately legible to anyone who entered. Not in a subtle way, in a completely obvious, olfactory, visible way. Because medieval candles came in two kinds, and the difference between them was not merely a matter of quality. It was a matter of class. The first kind was the tallow candle. Tallow is rendered animal fat, specifically the hard fat found around the kidneys and loins of cattle and sheep, boiled down until it liquefied, then cooled until it hardened into a dense, creamy, yellowish substance. Making tallow candles was a domestic skill, performed at home or by the local tallow chandler, and the process was relatively simple. A length of wool or cotton twisted into a wick, dipped repeatedly into a vat of molten tallow, withdrawn and cooled, then dipped again, layer by layer, until the candle was thick enough to burn for a useful amount of time. The tallow candle was cheap. It was available. It was made from materials that most medieval households had access to, particularly after the autumn slaughter, when animals were killed to reduce the number of mouths to feed through winter, and their fat was carefully rendered and stored. In a peasant household, tallow candles were one of the most essential winter preparations. They would be made in batches, stored in cool, dry places, and burned with the same careful rationing that governed everything else in a medieval home: the firewood, the salt, the grain. You burned what you needed. You wasted nothing. But here's the thing about tallow candles that no amount of medieval poetry romanticizes, because it simply cannot be. They smelled badly. The glycerine in animal fat produces, when burned, a thick, acrid smoke and a heavy, greasy odor, something between roasting animal fat and a poorly maintained slaughterhouse. Light several tallow candles in an enclosed space, and the smell becomes quite overwhelming. The walls blackened with soot. The air thickened. The smell clung to fabric, to hair, to food. And yet this was the smell of ordinary medieval evenings in ordinary medieval homes across most of Europe. This was what light cost. This was the price of being able to see after dark for the vast majority of people who have ever lived through the Middle Ages. Now consider the second kind of candle. The beeswax candle. Made from the wax that honeybees secrete to build their combs, beeswax is a remarkable material, harder than tallow, with a higher melting point, and crucially, a very different combustion profile. A beeswax candle burns slowly and steadily with almost no smoke. Its flame is bright and clean, significantly clearer than the murky flickering of tallow. And when it burns, it releases not an animal stench, but a faint, natural sweetness, the honey smell of the hive, delicate and pleasant. It also lasted considerably longer than tallow for the same size candle. And it was, of course, expensive. Considerably expensive because beeswax had to be harvested from honeybees, not a simple process, and processed, and the yield was relatively small. It took an entire honeycomb to produce a single small candle. Beeswax was, in the medieval economy, a premium material. It was used by institutions wealthy enough to afford it, the nobility, the upper clergy, and above all, the church. And this is where the story of the candle becomes something worth pausing on. Because beeswax did not become the candle of the church merely because it burned better. It became the candle of the church because of what bees were believed to be. Medieval theology had constructed a remarkable story around the honeybee. Bees, it was understood, reproduced without the carnal act, without the mess and sin of animal reproduction. They were creatures of a kind of miraculous purity. Some medieval monks believed that bees had been absent from the Garden of Eden and had therefore escaped the consequences of Eve's sin entirely. Others held that bees reproduced by something analogous to immaculate conception, that their wax was therefore unstained by the corruption of flesh. And so beeswax came to carry a theological meaning far beyond its practical virtues. It was pure. It was holy. And it was the only material deemed appropriate to illuminate the presence of God. Church law across much of medieval Europe specified that only beeswax candles could be burned during Mass, during the liturgy, before the altar. Not tallow, not rushlight. Only the wax of the bee burning clean and sweet in the sacred darkness of the nave. This meant that for most ordinary medieval people, the church was the only place they would ever encounter beeswax light. The only place they would ever see that clean, steady, almost smokeless flame. The church was brighter than anything in their daily lives. It smelled different. It felt different. And that difference was not accidental. It was designed. The overwhelming sensory experience of entering a medieval church, the light of dozens of beeswax candles against stone walls, the smell of clean wax and incense, the height of the vaulted ceiling above the smoky, ground-level world outside, was a calculated contrast with the smells and dimness and cramped warmth of everyday life. The church was, among other things, a light show, a demonstration of what the world could be if the world were holy. And ordinary people who had spent their week in homes lit by smelly tallow and smoky hearths walked into that space and felt the difference in their lungs and their eyes and their skin. That contrast was theological argument made physical. Darkness below, light above, the tallow world and the beeswax world. And you were in one, and you could only visit the other. There was, in London, a particularly telling expression of this division. The candle trade had organized itself into guilds, as all trades in medieval London eventually did. But the candle trade had two guilds. The tallow chandlers, who made and sold candles of animal fat, and the wax chandlers, who made and sold beeswax candles. These two guilds occupied different social positions, served different customers, and operated in what were essentially parallel economies: the same city, the same streets, the same general commodity, but two entirely different worlds. The wax chandlers served the crown, the church, the nobility. They supplied the great houses and the cathedrals. Their product was luxury. The tallow chandlers served everyone else. Their product was necessity. They were absolutely essential, arguably more essential in practical terms, because without them the great majority of urban households would have had no light at all. And yet they occupied a lower position in the guild hierarchy, a lower status in the social order. Because in the medieval mind, tallow was animal, and beeswax was divine. This is the hidden logic of medieval light. Not merely that some people had more of it than others, though that was true, but that light itself was stratified. That the quality of what burned in your home was a moral statement as well as a practical one. The person burning tallow was not merely poorer. In the symbolic language of the medieval world, they were living at a greater remove from the sacred. Their light was earthly, heavy with the smell of flesh. And while no medieval peasant would have articulated it in quite those terms, the symbolic structure was one they breathed in every evening, every time they lit their candle and smelled the familiar animal odor filling their home. It is worth pausing here for a moment, because I think there is something in this that speaks to an experience that is very old and very human. The experience of being told, through the physical world around you, what your place is. Of living in a particular kind of light, a particular kind of smell, a particular kind of warmth, not because you chose it, but because it is what belongs to you. And of occasionally catching a glimpse, through a cathedral door, of another kind of light entirely. Brighter, cleaner, and not for you. There was one candle that sat below even the tallow candle in the medieval hierarchy of light. The rushlight, made from the common reed that grew abundantly along rivers and marshes throughout Britain and northern Europe. The rushlight was the most stripped down, most economical form of illumination available. The reeds were harvested in late summer, dried, stripped of their outer casing to expose the soft white pith inside, then soaked in a trough of liquid animal fat, any fat that could be rendered, including kitchen grease and the scrapings of cooking pots. The finished rushlight was a limp, fragile stick of fat-soaked pith, held at an angle in a simple iron clip or propped in a notch in a piece of wood. It burned for perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour. It gave off a small, wavering flame, enough to see by, barely, in a small room if you held it close to your work. And it smelled like tallow, of burning animal fat. But it cost almost nothing. The materials were free. The skill required was minimal. And for the very poorest households, for the cottagers and field workers who could not afford even the relatively modest cost of tallow candles in quantity, rushlights were the light of most evenings. They worked, just barely, but they worked. And they were made mostly by women. The gathering of the rushes, the stripping of the pith, the soaking in fat, the careful drying and storage, These were domestic tasks that fell within the household economy that medieval women managed. The rushlight was ordinary and invisible and made by invisible hands, and it illuminated the ordinary invisible labor of evenings, mending, spinning, nursing children, preparing the following day's food. What fascinates me about the rushlight is its honesty. It made no claims. It was not beeswax pretending to holiness. It was not tallow pretending to sufficiency. It was the irreducible minimum of light, the absolute floor of what a household needed in order to function after dark. And in its smallness, in its brief and wavering flame, it tells us something true about the medieval world. That for most people, most of the time light was scarce. That evenings were short. That after dark, the options were gather close to the fire, burn your limited supply of light, or go to sleep. And most nights, most people went to sleep because the night was coming. And the night in the medieval world was something altogether different from the soft, managed dimness we know today. The night was a territory, and it had its own rules. But before we step into that darkness, before we follow the last candle flame out into the medieval streets and into everything that waited there after the curfew bell rang, there is one more piece of this world we need to understand. The moment each evening when the fire had to be covered, when the bell rang across the village or the town, and when every household performed the same ritual at the same time all across the medieval world, the moment of the couvre-feu, the covering of the fire, because that word, that act, contains inside it a story about fear and community and the extraordinary fragility of a world built almost entirely from wood. And that is where we are going next. The word is French. Couvre-feu. Cover fire. Say it slowly, and you can hear exactly what it means. Couvre, cover. Feu, fire. A simple instruction given every night across the whole of medieval Europe. Cover the fire. And this is where history performs one of its quiet sleights of hand. Because that phrase, couvre-feu, became in English the word curfew, a word we still use today, stripped entirely of its original meaning. When we say that a teenager has a curfew, when we speak of a wartime curfew, when we read of a government imposing a curfew on a restless city, we are using a word that originally had nothing to do with time restrictions or social control or political authority. It had to do with a clay pot placed over hot coals at the sound of a bell. It had to do with fire management. It had to do with the single most dangerous thing in a medieval town, the open flame left unattended through the night. To understand why covering the fire mattered so desperately, you have to understand what medieval towns were made of. Wood, primarily, overwhelmingly, almost universally, wood. The houses were wood-framed, their walls filled with wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched, deep layers of dried reeds or straw, layered and compressed, excellent insulation, beautiful in their way, and extraordinarily, almost magnificently flammable. The buildings were not spaced apart with the careful buffer zones of modern fire codes. They were pressed together along narrow streets, their upper stories jutting out over the lanes below until the buildings on opposite sides of the street nearly touched at the roofline. Between them ran gutters full of straw and refuse. Below them, stables full of hay. Nearby, workshops full of the materials of medieval trades: tallow, timber, flax, pitch, wool, rendered fat. Medieval towns were, in the coldest and most accurate description available, tinder boxes. And inside every house in that tinder box, every night, there burned an open fire. Not in a contained modern grate, not behind a glass screen. An open flame on a stone platform or in a pit in the floor, surrounded by the wooden walls and straw-strewn floor of a medieval home, tended carefully during the waking hours, and then left every single night with sleeping bodies around it and no one watching. The risk was not abstract. It was historical and recurring and catastrophic when it materialized. We will come back to the great fires later tonight, to the specific disasters that medieval cities suffered and what they reveal. But for now, what matters is this: the people who lived in these cities were not unaware of the danger. They knew. They knew in the way that people who have witnessed something terrible always know, with the specific embodied knowledge of a community that has watched its neighbor's house become a torch, has seen the fire leap from rooftop to rooftop in a dry summer wind, has spent a terrified night hauling water and tearing down buildings in the desperate attempt to create a fire break before everything was lost. They knew. And so they developed a system. Each evening, when the light began to fail, a bell rang. In England, usually around 8 o'clock. In some parts of Europe, 7. In larger cities, sometimes 9. The hour varied by place and era, but the function was the same, a signal to every household in hearing distance that it was time. Time to cover the fire. Time to perform the ritual of the couvre-feu. The device used to cover the fire was called, in English, the curfew, named directly after the French original. It was a dome-shaped cover made of terracotta clay or metal, designed to be placed over the banked embers of the evening fire. The curfew had vents, small holes or perforations in its sides, that allowed just enough air to reach the embers to keep them alive, smoldering gently through the night, without supplying enough oxygen to allow them to flare into full flame. A fire covered by a curfew was contained, safe, still breathing, but not burning. And in the morning, when the household woke, the curfew was lifted, the bellows were applied, and those sleeping embers woke with the family. The richer households had metal curfews, some of them ornate, with decorative punched patterns and elegant handles. The more modest households made do with plain terracotta, fired and functional. And the very poorest households, who could not afford even a simple curfew cover, banked their fires differently, raking ash over the embers into a mounded shape that insulated and contained them through the night. The principle was the same. Keep the fire alive. Keep it covered. Keep it small. And here is something that deserves a moment of quiet attention. This was a community act, not merely an individual one. When the bell rang for the couvre-feu, every household in a medieval town performed the same action at approximately the same time. Across hundreds of homes in the same village, along the same street, behind the same city walls, fires were being covered, embers were being raked, hearths were being banked, and families were preparing to settle into the night. It was, in its way, a collective ritual, a synchronized act of care. An entire community saying, at the same moment, we know the danger and we are choosing together to manage it. The curfew bell was not just a signal. It was a social contract expressed in sound. When William the Conqueror arrived in England in 1066, he did not invent the couvre-feu. The practice was already common across Europe, but he did formalize it, enforce it strictly, and attach penalties to its violation. There is a debate among historians about his true motivations. The official story was fire prevention, and that was certainly real. But William was also a conqueror, ruling over a people who had not entirely accepted his rule, and there was a political convenience to a law that required all fires, all lights to be covered after the evening bell. A city in darkness is a city where people cannot easily move, gather, meet, or organize. The couvre-feu law, whatever its fire prevention virtues, was also a law that made nighttime resistance harder to coordinate. Fire, in this reading, was not merely dangerous in the physical sense. It was dangerous in the political sense. A lit fire meant people were awake. People awake after dark meant things happening that the authorities could not see. The covering of the fire was in this light, also the covering of the night. Later English kings relaxed the strict enforcement of the curfew law. Henry I abolished the most severe penalties in 1100, but the practice of the evening bell continued for centuries after, deeply embedded in the rhythm of urban life. In many English towns, the curfew bell was still ringing as late as the 19th century, long after its original meaning had been forgotten, kept alive as tradition by communities that had inherited the habit without the context. The bell rang, the fires were covered, and the night began. Now, what did that night actually look like? What did it feel like to be a medieval person settling into their home after the couvre-feu, with the fire banked and breathing quietly beneath its clay cover, and the darkness of the medieval world pressing in from all sides? The central hearth we spoke of earlier, the communal fire of the great hall, was not the only source of light in a medieval home, but it was the primary one. And once it was covered, the supplementary light came from the candles and rushlights we have already met, the tallow candle placed in its iron holder on the table, the rushlight propped in its simple clip near the working woman's hands, the small oil lamp flickering in a corner. These lights were used carefully. They were not left burning without purpose. A tallow candle represented a measurable expense, not enormous, but real, and it was burned only as long as there was something worth illuminating. Work to be done, stories to be told, children to be settled, prayers to be said. And then, when the last task was finished, the last word spoken, the last prayer completed, the candle was snuffed, and the family slept in a darkness that I want to try to describe for you, because it is almost impossible to imagine from inside the permanently lit world we inhabit. Medieval darkness was not the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains closed, where you can still make out the shape of the door and the pale rectangle of the window. Medieval darkness, on a cloudy night, in a house with small or shuttered windows, with the fire covered and the candle out, was absolute. It was the darkness of a cave. The darkness where your eyes never adjust, where there is simply no light to work with. The darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. And this mattered. It mattered in ways that went far beyond the inconvenience of not being able to see. Because in the medieval imagination, darkness was not neutral. Darkness was inhabited. The theological and folkloric framework of medieval Europe was quite clear on this point. The night was a different territory from the day, not merely less convenient, morally and spiritually distinct. The darkness was where demons moved, where the souls of the dead walked before they found rest, where the wild hunt crossed the sky on certain terrible nights, where witches gathered, where illness traveled, where the protective structures of daytime, the church bell, the priest, the community of neighbors going about their ordinary business, were absent or weakened. This was not mere uneducated superstition. It was a coherent cosmology, a way of understanding the world that took seriously the reality of spiritual forces and their relationship to light and darkness. The light of fire and candle was not merely practical illumination. It was, quite literally, a form of protection, a signal, a declaration that this space was inhabited, was human, was under the protection of wakefulness and warmth. To have your fire go out in the night was not just cold. It was a kind of vulnerability, a lowering of the defenses. And certain folk traditions across medieval Europe held that the hearth fire should never be allowed to go entirely cold, that to extinguish it completely was to invite misfortune, to remove the household's protection, to leave the door open, metaphorically, for whatever moved in the dark. The fire was, in this understanding, a guardian, a small orange breathing guardian, banked under its clay cover, keeping the darkness at a certain distance through the long hours of the night. Consider what it meant then to be a person whose fire had gone out, who woke in the small hours to a cold hearth, to embers that had not survived the night, to the absolute darkness of a house with no light. The cold was physical. The dark was physical. But the vulnerability was also something older than either. Something that lived in the body as a memory of all the nights human beings had spent in the dark, with the fire out, before they understood what was dangerous and what was not, before they could tell the difference between a wolf at the edge of the firelight and a shadow of their own making. The instinct to tend the fire was ancient, far older than the Middle Ages, and the medieval person who woke to a cold hearth was feeling, in that moment, something that stretched back to the very beginning of human shelter. Something that said, this is wrong. The fire should be burning, and now you need to fix it. Now, before the light. This is, I think, one of the most quietly revelatory things about the medieval relationship to fire and darkness. It shows us something about the emotional life of people who lived in conditions we can barely imagine. The anxiety was not irrational. The darkness was actually dangerous, not only because of what their theology told them about it, but because of what it actually contained. A medieval town after dark was a place where you could not see the road, where a misstep could send you into an open drain or a pile of refuse. where robbery was entirely possible and where there were few institutional structures to prevent or punish it. The night watch existed, those lantern-carrying men who walked the streets after curfew, but they were few, and the streets were many, and their lanterns were small in a very large dark. The person who ventured out after the couvre-feu without a light was suspicious by definition. In the medieval social imagination, nothing good happened after dark without a reason. If you were out after curfew, you either had a lantern or you had something to hide. And the night watch was empowered to stop you and ask which it was. This is the world of the covered fire, intimate and communal within the household walls, anxious and vigilant at the threshold between inside and out. The hearth, banked for the night, was a kind of anchor, something waiting for morning, something that would still be there, still warm, still alive, when the household woke. And the morning return to the fire, the lifting of the clay curfew cover, the careful work with the bellows, the moment when the embers reddened and caught and flame appeared again, was not a trivial event. It was a small daily miracle. It was the household's renewal, the proof that the night had been survived, that the fire had lasted, that the day could begin. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A medieval family waking in the first gray light before sunrise. A cold room, a banked hearth, and the small careful ritual of coaxing the fire back to life, an act so ordinary that no one wrote about it, so daily that it left almost no record, and yet so fundamental that without it, nothing else was possible. The breakfast could not be cooked. The bread could not be baked. The workshop could not be warmed. The children could not be dressed and fed. Everything, every single morning act in a medieval household waited on this first act, the waking of the fire. There is something in this that I find deeply moving across all the distance of centuries. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so completely ordinary. Because it happened every morning in every household, across every season, for hundreds of years, this quiet act of tending, this daily labor of continuity, this insistence that the fire would not die. And because the people who performed it most often were women, the women who woke early, who bent over cold hearths, who applied bellows with skilled hands, who had learned from their mothers exactly how to read an ember, whether it still had heat in its heart, whether it could be brought back, whether this morning's fire would take, or whether they would need to walk to a neighbor's house with an empty pot in the cold morning air and ask, humbly and practically, for a light. These women are almost entirely invisible in the official record of medieval history. Their names were not written down. Their skill was not celebrated. Their labor was not counted. But their fires burned. Every morning, in every house, across the centuries. And those fires were the first thing. The thing before all other things. The foundation on which every other element of medieval daily life was built. As tonight goes on, we will step further into the world that fire made possible, into the candles that extended the working day, into the smoky darkness of the streets after the curfew bell, into the great churches blazing with holy light, and into the terrible moments when the fire that sustained life became the fire that ended entire cities. But I want you to carry this moment with you as we go. The gray morning, the cold room, the banked embers beneath the clay cover, and the woman bending close, bellows in hand, breathing life back into the fire. That is where this world begins. Every single day. That is where we begin. Think for a moment about what it costs to see. Not in the abstract sense, not the philosopher's question about perception and consciousness and the nature of light. In the most literal, practical, economic sense, what does it cost each evening to have enough light to do something useful after the sun goes down? For us, the answer is so small as to be nearly invisible. A flick of a switch. A fraction of a monthly bill so minor we never think about it. We live in a world so thoroughly saturated with artificial light that darkness in most of our lives is a choice rather than a condition, something we create deliberately for sleep or for mood, and then dissolve just as easily. But in the medieval world, light had a price. A real price, calculated every evening, rationed every week, managed with the same careful attention given to grain and salt and firewood. And the price you paid, the materials you burned, said something about you that was immediately legible to anyone who walked through your door. Not subtly, completely obviously. Because the two worlds of medieval light, the world of tallow and the world of beeswax, were as different from each other as the people who used them. We have already met these two candles briefly, but tonight I want to take you deeper into that distinction, because it is more than a matter of quality or expense. It is a map of the medieval social world written in flame. And at the bottom of that map, below the tallow candle, below even the cheapest form of purchased light, sat the rushlight. We have already met it, the reed stripped of its casing, soaked in kitchen fat, propped at its careful angle, burning for 20 minutes at most. The floor of what light could be. Above it sat the tallow candle. And here is where the story of medieval light becomes genuinely worth dwelling on, because tallow is where most people actually lived. Not in the extraordinary realm of beeswax, not in the desperate economy of the rushlight, but in the middle ground of tallow, the animal fat, the familiar smell, the blackening walls, which was the daily reality for the great majority of medieval people across every century and every country of Europe. Tallow, rendered fat from cattle and sheep, boiled down and clarified, and cooled into a dense yellowish material, was, in the most practical sense, civilization's light source for most of the medieval period. It was not pleasant, but it was there. And the tallow chandler who supplied it, who collected the raw fat, boiled it in his workshop, dipped his wicks in batch after batch until he had a stock worth selling, then carried or displayed his candles at market, was one of the most essential craftsmen in any medieval town of any size. Tallow chandlers operated in every town and most larger villages, selling candles ready-made to those who preferred to buy rather than make. The tallow candle burned longer than a rushlight, gave a more stable flame, and was easier to use. Set in a holder, it stood upright and burned predictably, without needing to be held at an angle. It was, in the language of its time, a proper candle, and its smell was the smell of most medieval evenings. Heavy, animal. The smell of burning fat, not the clean sweetness of beeswax, not the neutral non-smell of our modern paraffin, but something unmistakably organic and alive in its origins, something that reminded you, every time you breathed it in, that the light in your hands came from the body of a creature that had walked the same fields as you. Medieval households burned tallow with a pragmatic acceptance that we might find difficult to imagine. It was simply what the evenings smelled like, what your hair smelled like, what your clothes smelled like, what the walls of your home absorbed year after year until the timbers were dark with it. The soot of tallow candles blackened the inside of homes gradually but completely. This was not considered a sign of failure or neglect. It was evidence of use. Evidence that the house had been lived in, worked in, kept warm, and lit through many winters. A blackened ceiling beam was proof of domestic industry. Now rise again. To beeswax. We have spoken already about the theological significance of beeswax, the belief in the purity of the bee, the idea of the hive as a kind of sacred community untouched by the sin of flesh, the doctrine that only beeswax was fit to burn before the altar of God. But I want to linger here a little longer, because the practical experience of beeswax light was so different from tallow that it deserves its own moment of description. A beeswax candle, when it burns, is almost silent. The flame is steady, with very little wavering. The light it casts is noticeably whiter than the orange-yellow of tallow, closer to daylight in quality, brighter by a clear degree. And the smell, not the heavy animal smell of tallow, not the acrid smoke of rushing burning fat, a faint natural sweetness, the smell of the hive, of honey, very distantly present, as if the candle remembers what it was. To walk from a tallow-lit room into a beeswax-lit room was to enter a different sensory world entirely. The air felt cleaner. The light reached further into the corners. The darkness retreated a little further from the flame. And this is why the church chose it. Not merely out of theological symbolism, though that mattered enormously, but because beeswax light was experientially different. It transformed the space it occupied. A cathedral lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, by the tall altar candles, the votive candles massed in their iron stands, the candelabra processing through the nave on feast days, was not merely brighter than the world outside. It was qualitatively different, warmer in tone, more still, more intentional. For a peasant family coming in from a home lit by rushlights and tallow, from the ordinary animal smell of ordinary life, the church was an overwhelming sensory experience. The light alone was extraordinary. It was not the light they lived in. It was the light they were told God lived in. And that difference, that gap between the tallow world and the beeswax world, was maintained carefully, deliberately, as part of the spiritual technology of the medieval church. You were meant to feel the difference. You were meant to feel, the moment you walked through those doors, that you had left one kind of world and entered another. The smoke of your candles and your hearth, still in your clothing, still in your hair, and all around you, the clean, sweet burning of the sacred wax. In London, as we touched on before, this division had organized itself into two entirely separate trades. The tallow chandlers had received their royal charter in 1462, though the guild itself was far older, rooted in practices going back centuries before any formal recognition. They made and sold the candles of ordinary life. They supplied the households of merchants, craftsmen, and laborers. They filled the city's practical need for light. Their candles smelled. Their customers did not care. Light was light. The wax chandlers occupied a different position entirely. They supplied the great households, the royal court, the nobility, the church. Their product was considered a luxury, not because it was unnecessary, but because it was better, and in the medieval world, better things were understood to belong to better people. The two guilds coexisted in the same city, on the same streets, selling what was functionally the same product, a wick and a fuel, and yet they occupied entirely different social worlds. They did not collaborate. They did not overlap. Their membership did not intermingle. You were a tallow chandler, or you were a wax chandler, and that distinction was as fixed and as legible as any other marker of social position in the medieval world. Here is what I find quietly remarkable about this. The division between tallow and beeswax was not primarily about what the candles did. Both provided light. Both could illuminate a room well enough to work by, to eat by, to move through a space without tripping. The division was about what the candles meant, about the smell they left in the air, about the kind of darkness they pushed back, about whether your light was ordinary or elevated, animal or angelic, the world below or the world above. And this symbolic weight was not imposed from outside. It was lived. It was breathed. It was present in every room where a candle burned. The tallow chandler who lit his workshop candle at dusk and smelled the familiar animal smoke was not thinking consciously about his place in the social hierarchy. He was just lighting his candle. But the world in which that candle burned, the world that smelled that way, that blackened those walls, that pushed back that specific quality of darkness, was a world that knew, without needing to articulate it, exactly where it stood. There is something in this that I think carries across the centuries. The experience of being told, through the most ordinary materials of daily life, what you are worth, not through grand proclamations, not through laws written on parchment, but through the specific smell of the air in your home each evening, through the quality of the light you worked and ate and prayed by, through the small, daily, inescapable fact of what burned in your house and what it cost you and what it smelled like when it did. The beeswax world was not closed to everyone who lived in the tallow world. It was visible, accessible. You could walk into a church and stand in it. You could carry a single beeswax candle, purchased with saved money, or donated to you by a wealthier patron in a religious procession on one of the great feast days. You could receive, on the Feast of Candlemas each February, a blessed beeswax candle from the hands of the priest, and carry it home and burn it with great care, for safety in childbirth, for protection in storms, for the bedside of the dying. The blessed candle of Candlemas was one of the most treasured domestic objects in a medieval household. Not a decoration, a tool of spiritual protection. Something kept carefully, burned in pieces for specific sacred purposes, its wax used and reused until nothing remained. And on the feast day itself, the 2nd of February, exactly 40 days after Christmas, the entire parish would gather, each person holding a candle, and process through the church while the priest blessed the candles for the year to come. The image is worth sitting with for a moment. Every person in the parish, farmer and merchant, widow and child, old man and young woman, each one holding a lit candle, each flame a small point of warmth in the stone cold of February. The whole nave flickering with individual lights, each one held in a human hand. For this one day, the beeswax flame was not a privilege. It was a shared thing, something the whole community held at once. And I wonder what that felt like for the people whose home light was rushes soaked in kitchen fat, to hold, even briefly, the clean and sweetly burning wax, to feel the difference in their fingers, to smell the difference in the air, and to carry it home. We will come back to the great festivals of fire and light before this night is over, to the midsummer bonfires, to the Easter ceremonies, to the magnificent liturgical theater of the church and its management of sacred flame. But first, there is somewhere else we need to go. Somewhere darker. Somewhere that requires us to step outside the warmth of the hearth, outside the circle of candlelight, out through the door and into the street. Because the medieval night did not exist only inside houses. It existed outside them. In the darkness of the medieval street, after the curfew bell had rung and the fires had been covered and the candles had been snuffed, that darkness was something else entirely. And that is where this part of the story needs to take us. There is a specific quality to the dark. Those of us who have spent time far from cities, in a forest, or on a mountain, or in a field on a night without moon or stars visible through cloud, know something of what this means. The dark that arrives when all artificial light is removed is not merely the absence of something. It is a presence. It presses. It changes the way sound moves. It makes familiar distances uncertain and familiar shapes ambiguous. It produces, in most people, a very old and very physical response that is not quite fear and not quite alertness, but something between the two, a state of heightened attention, a feeling that the senses are reaching outward into a space they cannot adequately map. This is what medieval people felt every night. Not occasionally, in special circumstances. Every night. After the curfew bell rang and the fire was covered and the last rushlight was pressed out between careful fingers, the darkness that came into a medieval home was total. Not the managed dimness of a curtained bedroom, not the soft ambient glow that enters every modern space from screens and streetlights and the reflected light of cities against low cloud. Total darkness. The darkness of a sealed space with no light source at all. And outside the walls of that home, in the streets of a medieval town or village, the darkness was no less complete. There were no street lamps in medieval Europe. No torches mounted on posts at regular intervals. No lanterns hung at doorways by municipal authority. If you walked a medieval street at night, you walked in darkness, unless you carried your own light. And here is where the night reveals another layer of the medieval relationship with fire and light. Because to carry a light after dark, to walk the streets with a torch, a lantern, or even a rushlight, was to announce yourself. Not merely to be visible, to be legible. In the medieval night, a moving light was a moving person, and the question of who was moving through the darkness and why was a question that mattered enormously to the people whose job it was to maintain order in the night streets. The night watch, known in different places and periods by different names, but present in some form in most medieval towns of any size, were the men charged with patrolling the streets between the curfew bell and dawn. They carried lanterns, long poles, sometimes weapons, and they had authority to stop and question anyone they encountered. Because in the medieval social imagination, the logic of night was simple and severe. If you were out after curfew without a good reason and a source of light, you were a suspect. Not necessarily guilty of a specific crime, but suspect. Because nothing good, in the official view of medieval urban authority, happened in the dark without purpose. The darkness was where thieves worked, where the unhoused and the desperate moved, where people met who did not want to be seen meeting, where things happened that could not bear the light of day. And this was not entirely fantasy. Medieval cities had genuine problems of nighttime crime, theft, assault, the movement of stolen goods, the gathering of people with grievances who might organize into something dangerous. The darkness did genuinely provide cover for these things. And the response to that darkness was the night watch, men with lanterns moving through the streets, their own light a kind of authority, a claim on the night that said, "This space is watched, this dark is not absolute, order exists here even without the sun." The honest watchman was one kind of figure. There was another. The thief who worked specifically after the curfew, who knew the streets in darkness, who had learned to move without light, who had discovered that the same darkness that made honest people afraid gave the dishonest person a considerable advantage. The night was, in this sense, a contested space, not only dark, but divided between those who had light and those who did not, between those whose presence was sanctioned and those whose presence was hidden, between the authorized movement of the watchman with his lantern and the unauthorized movement of the figure who kept to the shadows specifically to avoid that lantern's reach. And fire, again, was at the center of this contest. Because the light you carried in the dark was not neutral, it was a statement. A lantern meant, "I am here, I am going somewhere, I have reasons I can give if asked." No lantern meant, "I do not wish to be seen." And in the binary moral logic of the medieval night, the person without a light was already presumed to have something to hide. There were, of course, many reasons why a person might be out after dark without a lantern. The candle had burned down. The lantern had blown out in the wind. The errand was unexpected, and the light had not been thought of. The person was too poor to own a lantern and had simply needed to be somewhere. The night watch, theoretically, was supposed to distinguish between the criminal and the merely unlucky. In practice, the unlucky person without a light had a difficult conversation ahead of them. The streets of a medieval town at night were not only dark, They were treacherous in a very physical sense. There were no paved surfaces in most medieval towns. The roads were dirt, rutted by cartwheels and churned by animal traffic, often muddy, often uneven. Down the center of many streets ran an open drain, the main channel for the town's waste. Human waste, animal waste, the runoff from tanneries and slaughterhouses and cookshops. A channel that was, in the dark, essentially invisible until you were already in it. The buildings overhung the streets, their upper stories jutting out as much as several feet, creating a kind of canyon effect that deepened the shadows and narrowed the visible strip of sky above. On a moonless night, in an overcast sky, with the curfew fire covered and no lantern in hand, a person walking a medieval street was navigating almost entirely by memory and touch. Knowing the road, knowing where the drain was, knowing the rise and fall of the ground beneath their feet, knowing by feel and by count of steps where they were. This is a form of knowledge we have lost so completely that it is difficult even to imagine recovering it. Not knowledge stored in books or records. Knowledge stored in the body, in the feet, in the hands that trailed along walls in the dark, in the nose that caught the particular smell of a tannery and knew, I have gone too far, I need to turn back. Medieval people navigated their own streets in darkness by bodily knowledge so intimate and so practiced that it was invisible, unremarked, uncelebrated, just part of what it meant to live in a place through many seasons and many dark nights. Now, what was happening during all this darkness inside the houses? The fire was covered. The candles were out. The family slept. But sleeping in a medieval household was not the private, compartmentalized, solitary experience it is for most of us today. In the one-room cottages of peasant families, everyone slept in the same space. Parents, children, sometimes extended family members, sometimes servants, all in the same room, all near the covered fire, all breathing the same air, warmed by the same banked heat. And they did not sleep in one continuous block. Medieval sleep, as the historian Roger Akirsch has documented in careful detail, was typically divided into two portions. There was the first sleep, the long initial rest that began shortly after dark and lasted several hours. And then there was a period of waking in the middle of the night, sometimes an hour or more, when people lay quietly in the dark, or talked softly, or got up to tend the fire, or to use the chamber pot, or to lie quietly in the deep silence of the middle of the night. And then there was the second sleep, which carried the household through to morning. This pattern of segmented sleep, unfamiliar to us, but normal for centuries before artificial lighting changed the rhythms of human rest, meant that the covered fire was important, not just as a safety measure, but as a companion through those quiet middle-of-the-night hours. The faint red glow of embers through the vents of the clay curfew cover. A tiny visible warmth in the total darkness of the room. Not enough to read by. Not enough to work by. But enough to see that the fire was still alive. Enough to know that the darkness, while complete, was not quite absolute. Enough, perhaps, to allow the person lying awake in the small hours to feel that the household was anchored to something warm, that the night had not won entirely. There were people for whom the middle of the night was a working time, not by choice, but by necessity. The baker who needed to have bread ready by early morning rose in the deep middle of the night to begin. The blacksmith who had a particular task to complete. The midwife called from sleep by a knock at the door. The watchman who worked the dark hours and slept by day. For these people, fire in the night was not a comfort to drift to sleep by. It was the center of work. The fire that woke them, stirred back into full flame long before dawn, was the pivot on which their night turned. And the knowledge of how to wake a fire in complete darkness, by touch and habit, was a skill these people had learned until it was as natural as breathing. The hands knew what to do. The body knew the shape of the hearth. The fingers knew how much tinder to add, how hard to blow, how long to wait for the flame to take. This is another piece of the medieval relationship with fire that I want to make sure we do not pass by too quickly. The embodied knowledge of fire, not theoretical, not learned from a book, learned from a body beside another body over years until the knowledge was in the hands and not the head. Mothers teaching daughters, fathers teaching sons, masters teaching apprentices in the specific requirements of their craft's fire, the even heat of the bread oven, the roaring intense heat of the forge, the low sustained warmth of the dye vat, the carefully modulated heat of the apothecary's preparation. Fire was not one thing. It was dozens of things. Each trade, each task, each material had its own fire, its own temperature, its own duration, its own relationship with air and fuel and time. And the people who knew how to build and sustain exactly the right fire for exactly the right purpose were not merely warm. They were skilled. Their knowledge had economic value. Their knowledge kept families alive through winters. Their knowledge was, in a very real sense, the foundation of medieval technical civilization, more ancient than any guild, more fundamental than any trade, the original human skill from which all others descended. But there was something else that fire did in the darkness of a medieval night. Something that has almost nothing to do with warmth or light or skill. Something that belongs to the territory of the spirit. The fire that burned in the medieval home, or rather the fire that smoldered under its clay cover, was understood to be a kind of living presence. Not literally, in most cases. Not a spirit in the theological sense, but something that partook of life in a way that made its extinguishing feel like more than a practical failure. Across the folklore of medieval Europe, in England, in France, in Germany, in the Norse traditions that still lived in the northern countries, the hearth fire carried a moral weight. To let the fire die was to fail in something essential, not just practically, symbolically. The fire that had been kept burning since your grandfather's time, that had been carried from the fire in your mother's house when you married and moved to your own home, that had been tended through illness and grief and hard winters and difficult harvests, that fire was a thread of continuity, a connection to the people who had tended it before you, a living record of the household's history. And its death was not neutral. In many folk traditions, a fire that went out overnight without apparent cause was an omen. Something had shifted. Something had gone wrong. The fire knew before you did. And so the act of tending the fire, of checking it before sleep, of listening for the sound of it through the night, of waking in the first light to coax it back, was not merely housekeeping. It was an act of care for something that mattered in ways that went beyond the practical. Something that was in the medieval understanding as much a part of the household as the people themselves. This is the texture of the medieval night, not the dramatic darkness of ghost stories and horror, but the intimate, managing, anxious, careful darkness of people who understood, in their bodies, in their folklore, in their daily practice, that fire was the thing that held the night at a certain distance. Not perfectly, not always, but enough, just enough. And in the morning, when the curfew cover came off, and the bellows worked, and the flame rose again, the night was over. The house was itself again. The day could begin. But there was one place in the medieval world where the night was never entirely dark, where fire burned through every hour, not merely as survival, but as statement, where light was not rationed, not hidden, not covered at the sound of a bell, but offered freely, extravagantly, in the sight of everyone who passed. That place was the church, and the light that burned there, the thousands of beeswax candles, the altar flames, the great processional lights of the feast days, was a different kind of fire altogether. It was fire with intention, fire as theology, fire as the most persuasive argument the medieval church had for what it claimed to be. And that is precisely where we are going next, into the light that never went out, into the sacred fire, and into what it meant for ordinary people living in a tallow and rushlight world to stand inside a space where the darkness was almost entirely, deliberately, beautifully defeated. Picture the approach. You are walking toward a medieval cathedral. Perhaps it is a winter evening, just after Vespers, the evening prayer, and the light outside is the flat gray of January dusk. The street around you is what we have described, mud and shadow, the smell of the town, the distant sound of shutters being closed against the cold. And ahead of you, through the great doors that stand open even in winter for the evening service, there is light. Not a soft suggestion of light, a blaze. The interior of a large medieval cathedral on a feast day, lit by its full complement of candles, would have been something close to overwhelming for eyes accustomed to the ordinary darkness of medieval life. The altar candles alone, tall, pale, burning cleanly in their heavy iron stands, would have cast a steady white light across the chancel. But they were far from alone. Along the nave, in the side chapels before the shrines of saints, in the niches of pillars, on the sills of windows, candles burned in their hundreds. Votive candles, offered by the faithful in petition or in gratitude. Candles burning for the souls of the dead, their flames a proxy for the prayers the living could not be present to say. Candles placed before the image of the Virgin, before the reliquary of a saint, before the carved Christ in agony or the painted angels on the rood screen. Every one of them beeswax, every one of them burning clean and sweet in the stone space. And high above, where the vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow, the light of all those candles caught the gold of painted decorations, the glint of gilded saints, the shimmer of precious metal reliquaries, the deep blue of a painted heaven with its stars. This was the sensory argument. Not written down, not preached from a pulpit, simply experienced in the body by anyone who walked through those doors. The world outside, cold, dark, smelling of animals and sewage and tallow smoke. The world inside, bright, warm, fragrant with beeswax and incense, humming with the deep tones of plain chant, glittering with the light of 100 carefully tended flames. No document, no sermon, no theological treatise could make the argument that this made. The argument was, there is another world, and it is like this, and you can enter it. The management of fire and light within the medieval church was not left to chance or individual initiative. It was organized, regulated, and in many cases assigned to specific people as their primary religious duty. In larger churches and cathedrals, there were sacristans, lay workers, or minor clergy, whose responsibilities included the care of the church's candles and lamps. They filled the oil lamps. They replaced the candles as they burned down. They snuffed and replaced and repositioned and cleaned the wax drippings from the candle holders. They managed the inventory of wax, an expensive and carefully tracked commodity, and ensured that the right candles were burning in the right places for the right liturgical occasions. This was not simple work. The liturgical calendar of the medieval church was complex and precise, and different occasions called for different quantities and arrangements of light. Ordinary weekdays, a modest illumination, enough for the clergy to read from, enough to indicate the sacred nature of the space. Sundays and minor feasts, more candles, additional dignity. The great feasts, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the feast of the church's patron saint, a full blazing display, every holder filled, every lamp lit, the entire interior transformed into something close to what the church's theology promised about the light of the divine. The difference in illumination between an ordinary Tuesday Mass and the Easter Vigil was not merely visual. It was emotional, spiritual. The medieval worshipper did not experience these occasions as interchangeable. The candle count was part of the feast, part of how the church year was felt in the body rather than merely known in the mind. And the greatest feast of light in the medieval church calendar was exactly that, a feast of light. The Easter Vigil. The ceremony that took place on the night before Easter Sunday, beginning in complete darkness. Complete darkness. All the candles in the church extinguished. Every lamp put out. The church, which ordinarily burned its lights through every service, deliberately, ceremonially dark. The congregation gathered in that darkness and waited. And then a single flame was struck. Outside the church door, in the cold night air, the new fire was kindled, in some traditions from flint and steel, in others from a burning glass focused on the sun's light, but always new, always made fresh for this occasion, never carried from the fires of daily life. The Paschal candle was lit from that new fire. A great column of beeswax, as tall as a man, white and unwavering. And from the Paschal candle, the light began to spread. The deacon carrying it into the darkened church, pausing to sing the exultet, the ancient hymn of the Easter candle, while one by one, person by person, the small candles held by the congregation were lit from the great candle or from one another in a chain of fire. The image is extraordinary. A darkened church, one flame, and then two, and then 10, and then hundreds. The darkness retreating person by person as the light spread through the congregation until the whole nave was blazing, and every face in it was illuminated by fire that had come, ultimately, from a single source. This was, in explicit theological terms, a reenactment of creation. Light out of darkness, life out of death. The resurrection made visible in the spreading of flame. It was theater of the highest order. And it was fire, used with intention and beauty to do something that words alone could not accomplish. To make a congregation feel, in their bodies, what the resurrection might mean. But the church's relationship with fire was not limited to the interior of its buildings or the managed beauty of its liturgy. Fire moved outside, into the streets, into the fields, into the great outdoor celebrations that marked the turning of the year, celebrations that blurred, sometimes uncomfortably for church authorities, the boundary between Christian observance and older traditions of fire that predated Christianity by centuries. The midsummer bonfire. Lit on the eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist, the 23rd of June, the midsummer bonfire was one of the most widely observed, popular rituals of medieval Europe. Virtually every community participated. Every village, every town, every parish. And what they did was simple. They built a fire. Not in a hearth, not in a fireplace. In the open air. In the street, or in the square, or on the hillside above the town. A great bonfire, built from wood contributed by the whole community, lit when full dark had fallen, burning through the night. Around it the people gathered. The midsummer bonfire was not merely a party. It was understood, in a way that was partly Christian and partly much older, as a protective act. The smoke of the bonfire, rolling across fields and pastures, was believed to protect the crops. The animals of the village were sometimes driven through the edge of the smoke, or past the embers, to protect them from illness through the year. Young men and boys leaped through or across the flames, an act of both bravado and genuine folk belief, the idea that the fire's touch protected, purified, transferred some of its energy to the person who was brave enough to meet it. And the embers of the midsummer bonfire, carefully gathered when the fire had burned low, were taken home, into the house, to the hearth. A coal from the great shared fire brought back to the private fire. The community's flame and the household's flame connected for another year. This is the detail that moves me most in the whole history of medieval fire. The ember carried home from the bonfire. The small act of continuity, taking something from the center of the communal gathering and bringing it back into the private space of the home, making sure that what had burned publicly also burned privately, that the household was linked to the village linked to its fields, the fields linked to the turning of the year. The fire in your hearth after midsummer carried something of the fire that everyone had stood around together. Your private warmth carried a memory of communal warmth. Your household's flame carried a trace of the great shared flame. And in the medieval understanding of what fire was and what it meant, this was not a trivial thing. It was a form of belonging. The church authorities were not always comfortable with the midsummer bonfire. The leaping through flames, the driving of animals through smoke, the folk magic of the embers, these things sat uneasily alongside Orthodox Christian practice. They felt to many churchmen too old, too rooted in something that predated the faith. There were periodic attempts to suppress or redirect the most obviously pagan elements of the celebration. There were sermons preached against the fires. There were prohibitions written into local church records. But the fires burned anyway. Year after year, generation after generation, because the fire was not a superstition to be corrected by theology. It was a need. The need to mark the turning of the year with something visible and shared. The need to do together in the open air something that acknowledged the power of fire over life and over fear. The need to leap through flame and feel, even if only for the half second of the jump, even if only in the rush of heat and the brief sting of smoke, that you had done something brave and something ancient and something real. The church could not fully suppress this because the church itself was built on the same fundamental human relationship with fire. The candles on the altar and the bonfire in the street came from the same place. They answered the same need. They were both, in their different registers, ways of saying, we are not helpless before the darkness. We have fire. We know how to tend it. We know what it means. The same impulse that lit the Paschal candle in the darkened Easter church lit the midsummer bonfire in the open night. The same human hunger for light. The same refusal to let the darkness be the last word. But fire in the medieval world was not only sacred and sustaining, it was also terrifying. And it could turn. The same fire that warmed the hall and illuminated the nave and connected the household to the community, that fire could, in one unlucky moment, one careless second, one gust of wind at the wrong angle, one ember spat from a hearthstone onto a rush-strewn floor, become something else entirely. Something that did not sustain. Something that consumed. The great medieval fires, the urban disasters that periodically reduced entire neighborhoods, entire cities to ash, were not the result of negligence or stupidity. They were the inevitable consequence of building a civilization out of wood and straw and keeping fire at its center. They were what happened, eventually, when the thing that made life possible was also the thing most capable of ending it. And the history of those fires, of what they destroyed and what they revealed and what they changed, is the last place tonight's story needs to take us. Not as a horror story, not as a disaster narrative, but as the final piece of what fire meant in the medieval world. Because it is only when you understand what people lost, what a single uncontrolled fire could do to a community built of wood and straw and tallow, that you fully understand why the curfew bell mattered, why the clay fire cover mattered, why the careful banking of embers every night mattered, why the entire elaborate system of fire management that structured medieval life was not overcaution, not superstition, not bureaucratic control, but survival. Simple, daily, necessary, unglamorous survival. And the women and men who tended those fires, who kept them burning and kept them covered and kept them from becoming disasters, they were doing something that required more knowledge and more vigilance and more daily sustained attention than almost anything else in the medieval world. They were keeping the darkness out, one night at a time, one carefully banked ember at a time. There is one more dimension of the medieval night that I want to bring you into before we reach the fires. Something that rarely appears in the official histories. Something that lived in the private, unrecorded hours between the curfew bell and the dawn. The medieval household, settled for the night with its fire covered and its candles out, was not a silent place. It breathed. People coughed and turned and murmured. Children called out in sleep. Animals shifted in the space beyond the partition. Wind moved through gaps in the thatch, and the timbers of the house contracted with the cold, making small sounds that the house dwellers had learned to read the way a sailor reads the sounds of a ship. This sound was creak, the house settling. This sound was the wind finding a new path through a hole that needed patching. This sound, a faint crackle, a shift, was the curfew cover settling over the embers. People who lived in these houses knew their sounds. They knew the difference between the ordinary noises of a winter night and the sounds that required attention. A fire that had thrown an ember against the floor covering of straw made a very particular sound. A slow, whispering kind of crackle that, once you had been taught to hear it, was unmistakable. And the women who slept nearest the hearth, who had in many households the morning fire as their first responsibility, often slept with this quality of awareness in them. Half awake to the night, not anxious in the modern sense, but attentive in the way of people who have learned that attention is a form of protection. There were, across medieval Europe, records of household fires that were caught before they spread because someone woke. Because a woman in her first sleep heard something change in the quality of the night and roused herself to look. Because a child's cry brought a parent from sleep to find a spark on the rush floor that had not yet become a flame. Because the vigilance that fire required, that daily, nightly, constant low-level vigilance, was not paranoia. It was correct. The danger was real, and the people who felt it most were the people who lived closest to it, who slept nearest the hearth, who woke earliest to tend it, who understood in their bodies how quickly a manageable situation could become an unmanageable one. This is something that the written record of the Middle Ages rarely captures. The records we have are of disasters, of the great fires that consumed neighborhoods and cities, the events dramatic enough to be written down and remembered. But the disasters that were prevented, the sparks caught, the embers secured, the night passed safely because someone was awake enough to notice, those are entirely invisible in the historical record. And yet they happened constantly, far more often than the disasters, far more often than the fires. The skill and vigilance of ordinary people, maintained across centuries of nights, kept the medieval world from burning far more often than it failed to do so. We remember the failures because they were catastrophic. We do not remember the successes because they were ordinary. But they were not small. They were the daily, nightly, unrecorded triumph of the people who understood fire and kept it in its place. And I think that deserves a moment of acknowledgement across all the distance of the centuries, not as sentimentality, but as accuracy. The great medieval fires that we are about to consider were the exceptions. The careful nights, the covered embers, the banked hearths, the women half awake to the sounds of the house, those were the rule. And it is only because the rule held most of the time that there was anything left to burn when the exceptions came. And we will follow those embers in the last stretch of tonight's journey into the disasters that proved why they mattered so much, and into the quiet, resilient, undefeated truth of people who lost everything to fire and then built the fire again. There is a phrase that appears in medieval chronicles with a regularity that becomes, after a while, quietly devastating. Combusta est civitas. The city was burned. It appears in the records of English towns, of French towns, of German towns, of the great mercantile cities of the Low Countries, and the cathedral cities of Italy. It appears in different hands, in different centuries, written by monks and clerks and town administrators who found themselves reaching for the same plain Latin phrase because there was no softer way to say what had happened. The city was burned. Not a building. Not a street. The city. We have spoken throughout this night about fire as something tended and managed and carefully contained. The banked hearth, the clay curfew cover, the rushlight burned economically in its iron clip. We have spoken about fire as warmth and light and community and spiritual meaning. And all of that is true. But there is another truth that sits alongside it, always present, never entirely hidden in the medieval world. The truth that the same fire that warmed you could kill you. That the same material, wood and straw and rendered fat, that made life possible in winter was also what made medieval cities so extraordinarily fragile. That the skill and vigilance of ordinary people, which we have been honoring tonight as something quiet and heroic, was necessary precisely because the alternative was catastrophic beyond imagining. Let me take you to London. The year is 1212. The summer has been dry. The city, already one of the largest in Northern Europe, with a population somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people crammed inside its ancient walls, is a city of timber and thatch. The buildings press against each other along streets barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Upper stories overhang the lanes, reaching toward each other across the gap, until, in the oldest and most crowded parts of the city, neighbors on opposite sides of the street could almost reach out and touch hands. Below these buildings run the open drains. Around them, the straw-filled yards of stables and workshops, the stacked wood of merchants, the barrels of oil and tallow that feed the city's candles and lamps. The curfew bell rings every night. The fires are covered. And for most nights, for most years, this is enough. But on the 10th of July, 1212, something goes wrong. A fire starts in Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames. The exact cause is lost to history. Perhaps an ember from a hearth. Perhaps a candle knocked from its holder. Perhaps a spark from a forge that landed on dry thatch on a dry July night. We do not know. What we know is what happened next. the fire caught. In the specific conditions of that dry summer, the parched wood of the buildings, the low water in the wells, the wind, it did not behave the way fires are supposed to behave when people respond quickly. It spread instead. Not slowly, building from house to house as people fought and contained it, but fast, leaping from rooftop to rooftop across the narrow lanes, the flames finding the overhanging upper stories of the buildings and using them as bridges, crossing the gaps between structures in a matter of seconds. And now something happens that turns a disaster into something worse. The people of London, hearing the alarm, poured onto London Bridge to watch. And the bridge too caught fire. Perhaps from embers carried on the wind, perhaps from a building at its edge. The accounts differ, but what they agree on is the result: fire at both ends of the bridge. Trapped between them, the crowds who had come to watch. The chroniclers who recorded this event placed the death toll at somewhere between 3,000 and the frankly unimaginable number of 12,000. The higher figures are certainly exaggerated, but even the lower estimate, if accurate, would make the 1212 fire one of the deadliest single events in London's medieval history. More people died in this fire than would die in the far more famous Great Fire of London in 1666. They died not because the fire was too big to fight, in the end. They died because the bridge burned, and the escape route closed, and the darkness and the smoke and the panic did what panic always does in a confined space. And they died because the city was made of wood. This is the thing that the medieval authorities knew, and that the medieval chronicles record with a kind of grim resignation, and that the medieval city had to live with year after year and century after century. The city was made of wood. And as long as the city was made of wood and fire burned at its center every night, the disaster was not a question of if. It was a question of when. And how bad. The great fires of medieval Europe, and there were many, the chronicles record them with the steady frequency of seasons, followed a recognizable pattern. A starting point, a hearth, a candle, a forge fire, a baker's oven, an accident in a workshop where flammable materials were stored. A moment of failure, the curfew not properly observed, the embers not adequately banked, the spark not caught in time, the neighbor's shout not heard quickly enough. And then the spread. Because in a medieval city, the spread was what mattered. A single house burning was a tragedy for a family. A single street burning was a disaster for a neighborhood. But fire in the right conditions, dry summer, strong wind, closely packed wooden buildings, streets too narrow for effective firefighting, did not stop at a house or a street. It moved. With a purposefulness that survivors described in terms of living intention, as if the fire knew where it wanted to go, as if it chose its path. Lübeck burned in 1157 in 1173 in 1205 in 1251. Rouen burned in 1200 and again in 1210. Utrecht burned in 1253 for 9 days. These are not rare anomalies. They are a rhythm, a grim recurring beat in the life of every medieval city. The question is not whether a particular city would burn. It is how many times and how completely, and what would be done afterward. Because here is the thing that the chronicles also record with the same steady frequency. What was done afterward? After the fire of 1212 in London, the authorities looked at the bridge and the burned streets and made decisions. Stone where before there had been wood. Wider gaps between buildings. Regulations about thatch, about the storage of flammable materials, about the construction of buildings in the most fire-vulnerable areas. Lübeck, after its third and fourth great fires, became one of the first cities in Northern Europe to mandate stone construction in certain districts, and the stone buildings that survive from those post-fire rebuilding periods still stand today. The fires taught, not cheaply, not without enormous suffering, but they taught. Each disaster became a lesson in the specific vulnerability of the city, and each rebuilding incorporated something of that lesson, even if imperfectly, even if the new buildings were sometimes no safer than the old ones, even if the regulations were only partially enforced, and the wood crept back in where stone was too expensive. The cities rebuilt. They always rebuilt. But before the rebuilding came the fighting. And the fighting of medieval fire is a story that deserves its own moment of attention, because it reveals, perhaps more clearly than anything else we have considered, the full weight of what ordinary people in medieval cities understood about the danger they lived with. There was no fire brigade in medieval Europe in any sense we would recognize. No organized corps of trained firefighters. No dedicated equipment maintained at public expense. No hoses, no pumps, no ladders designed for the purpose. What there was instead was the community. The neighbors who heard the alarm and came. Not because they had been trained or paid or assigned, but because in a world of closely packed wooden buildings, your neighbor's fire was your fire, and everyone understood this with an immediacy that needed no explanation. The tools they brought were the tools of ordinary life. Buckets. The same buckets used to carry water from the well to the kitchen were formed into chains, human chains, stretching from the nearest water source to the burning building, passing filled buckets one way and empty ones the other. This bucket chain, simple, inefficient by modern standards, and entirely dependent on having enough people willing to stand in it for as long as necessary, was the primary firefighting technology of the medieval world. It worked, partially, sometimes. It could douse a single building that had caught in its early stages, before the fire had spread to the roof. It was helpless against a fire that had already claimed the thatch and was throwing embers across the narrow lane to the buildings opposite. The second tool was the fire hook, a long pole with an iron hook at its end, used not to fight the fire directly, but to pull down burning buildings in the path of the fire's spread, to create, by deliberate demolition, a gap in the urban fabric that the fire could not leap across. This was brutal and effective in a way that the bucket chain often was not. A building pulled down before the fire reached it, sacrificed the structure to save the street. The logic was cold but sound, and the people doing the pulling, hauling at the long poles with the fire roaring behind them and embers falling around them, were not firefighters. They were the butcher and the baker, the smith and the cloth merchant, whoever was there and strong enough and willing to stand close enough to the heat to grip the pole. The fire watch was another institution that medieval cities developed in response to the recurring disaster. In some towns, particularly after a major fire had demonstrated the cost of catching things too late, a formal system of watchers was established, men assigned to stand on high points, on church towers and market hall roofs, looking for the first sign of smoke, looking for the moment when a curfew cover had failed, when an ember had escaped, when the smoke of a single hearth had become something different and more urgent than the ordinary smoke of ordinary evening life. The earlier the alarm was raised, the more the bucket chain could accomplish. Every minute mattered. Every neighbor who heard the shout and came mattered. The community's speed and size and willingness to act together were, in a very literal sense, the difference between a story about one burned house and a story about a burned city. And so the medieval response to fire was also, always, a test of community, a test of whether people would come, of whether they knew what to do when they arrived, of whether they trusted each other enough to form the chain and work together in the heat and noise and confusion of a fire that was trying to become something uncontrollable. Most of the time, the answer was yes. Most of the time, neighbors came. Most of the time, the fire was caught and fought and reduced to something a community could manage. The disasters, the great fires of the Chronicles, were the times the community was overwhelmed. But those were the exceptions, as we have said. And the rule was the bucket chain formed at midnight. The neighbors who came running. The fire hook dragged through the street by people who did not have to be there but were. The city that did not burn because enough people understood, in their bodies and their daily practice, what fire required of them. And in the rebuilding, there is something I want to hold up to the light for a moment. Because the decision to rebuild, to return to the same streets, the same neighborhoods, the same proximity to the same danger, was not denial. It was not stupidity. It was a statement about what made a place home and what made life worth continuing that goes beyond practicality entirely. The people who lost their homes to fire lost almost everything. Not just the building. The furniture, the tools, the stored food, the clothing, the small objects accumulated across a lifetime, the wooden chest, the clay pots, the spinning wheel, the single good knife. Things that were not merely possessions, but the material fabric of a life. A medieval household fire was a kind of erasure. Not of the people, if they were lucky enough to escape, but of the physical evidence that their life had existed, that they had lived somewhere, that they had made something. And yet, the survivors came back. They set up temporary shelters in the ruins, burning what charred wood could be scavenged. They accepted gifts from neighbors and the church. They went to the courts to establish what had been lost and what assistance they were owed. They borrowed timber. They gathered stone. And they built again. Not in some other place, some safer distance from the city that had burned them. In the same place. Because the place was theirs. Because the community was there. Because the well was there, and the market was there, and the church was there, and the neighbors who had helped them through the worst night of their lives were there. And because, when the new house was finished, and the first fire was laid in the new hearth, and the tinder caught and the flame rose, the life that had been burned away began again, Different, diminished for a time, but continuous. The fire that had destroyed and the fire that rebuilt, the same element, the same ancient companion, serving now as it had always served. As the beginning, the first act of every household, the proof that habitation was possible here, in this place, in this life. This is what the medieval relationship with fire ultimately reveals, when you follow it all the way through the careful morning kindling, and the rationed candles, and the curfew bell, and the terrified nights of urban disaster, and the long work of rebuilding. It reveals a relationship with something essential that was both trusted and feared, necessary and dangerous, sustaining and consuming, a companion that could never be taken entirely for granted, and yet without which nothing else, not warmth, not food, not light, not safety, not community, was possible. The post-fire regulations that emerged across medieval Europe were not merely administrative responses. They were the written form of hard-won collective knowledge. After the great fires of Lubeck in the 13th century, the city mandated stone for new construction in the most vulnerable districts. After repeated fires in English market towns, local ordinances began specifying the minimum distance between certain buildings, the prohibition of thatch roofs in certain streets, the requirement to maintain a bucket of water at the door during certain seasons. These regulations were imperfectly observed, inconsistently enforced, routinely circumvented by people who could not afford the safer materials, or who rebuilt in the fastest and cheapest way available to them. But they accumulated. Generation by generation, disaster by disaster, a body of knowledge about how to build a city that was less likely to burn grew up alongside the cities themselves. The chimney, which we met early in tonight's story as an invention that changed the social architecture of the medieval home, was also, in the longer view, a fire safety measure. A dedicated flue for smoke was a safer arrangement than an open central hearth with a hole in the roof. The spread of fireplace and chimney construction across the 12th and 13th centuries reduced, incrementally, the risk of accidental fire in individual homes, not eliminated it. Chimneys themselves caught fire. The creosote deposits in an older chimney could ignite, sending a column of flame up through the interior of the flue, and sometimes setting the roof alight from above. The chimney sweep, who emerged as a necessary trade in direct response to the chimney's spread, was one of the less glamorous products of medieval fire management. A small person, often a child, sent up into the dark, narrow flue with a bundle of brushes to scrape the deposits from the interior walls. Unglamorous, unpleasant, genuinely dangerous, and absolutely necessary if the chimney was to do its job safely. Every element of medieval fire safety, from the curfew bell to the chimney sweep, was a response to the same underlying reality. Fire was necessary. Fire was dangerous. The gap between those two facts was managed by skill, by regulation, by community practice, by the accumulated knowledge of people who lived with fire as an immediate daily presence. And that management was never finished, never complete, never entirely successful. It was ongoing, an unending negotiation between the warmth people needed and the destruction they feared. And the people who sustained that negotiation, generation after generation, were not heroes in any dramatic sense. They were householders and watchmen and chimney sweeps and night watchmen and tallow chandlers and the women who woke early. Ordinary people doing the daily work of keeping the world from burning. And that ordinary work, sustained across centuries, is the quiet foundation on which medieval civilization rested. As tonight goes on into its final passages, I want to bring you gently back to the beginning, to the hearth, to the embers, to the gray morning light and the bellows and the breath, because everything we have covered tonight, the chimneys and the candles and the curfew bell and the cathedral light and the bucket chain and the burning cities, all of it circles back to that one first act, that single morning gesture, the ember tended, the fire woken, the proof that it had survived the night, the beginning of another day. Consider for a moment what that act meant to the person performing it, not as a concept, as a physical experience. You have been asleep. The room around you is cold, not the managed coolness of a modern bedroom, but the deep cold of an unheated space in winter, the kind of cold that stiffens the fingers and makes the muscles reluctant. You rise from your pallet or your bench, pulling your cloak around you. The room is dark, or nearly so. Whatever gray light seeps through the thatch or under the door is not enough to see clearly by. And you cross to the hearth. You lift the clay curfew cover and feel the faint warmth that rises from beneath it. The embers are still there. Still red, still alive, still holding the heat of last night's fire in their orange hearts. You feed them carefully. A pinch of dried grass, a curl of thin wood. You apply the bellows, steady, even strokes, close to the embers, but not so close as to scatter the ash, and you watch. The red deepens. A thread of smoke rises. And then, the moment that must have felt every single morning like a small miracle, the flame, a tongue of orange, clean and alive, rising from the darkness of the hearth into the cold air of the room. The fire was there. It had made it through the night. And everything, the breakfast, the bread, the warmth, the work, could follow. I do not think we should pass over this lightly. The daily relief of that moment, the embers still glowing, the fire still possible, the night safely navigated, was not nothing. It was, in a world where the alternative was real and cold and difficult, a genuine comfort, a daily proof that the household was intact, that the thread of warmth and continuity had not broken in the dark. And the person who felt that relief most keenly, who bent closest to the hearth and breathed most carefully into the waking ember, was the person who had understood longest and most clearly what it meant. The person who knew the fire, who had tended it through more mornings than she could count, who carried its requirements in her hands and her breath and her unhurried, practiced attention. And in that knowledge, that quiet, embodied, uncelebrated knowledge, there is something worth honoring across all the centuries and all the distance, not as sentiment, but as recognition. She kept the fire, and the day began. The night is very deep now, and that feels right for where we have arrived in this story. We began in the cold, In that first quiet moment before the fire, the banked embers, the cold room, the breath held close to the hearth, we have traveled through the smoky halls of early medieval life, where everyone slept together in the warmth of a shared hearth, and the architecture of fire was also the architecture of community. We have walked through the two worlds of candlelight, the tallow world and the beeswax world, and understood what it meant in the medieval social order to live in one kind of light and be permitted to glimpse the other. We have stepped into the darkness of the medieval night and walked those streets with the watchmen, felt the total dark of a world without electric light, and understood why the covered fire in its clay dome meant something beyond fire prevention. We have stood in the blazing interior of a cathedral on a feast day and felt what beeswax light does to a space and to the people who stand inside it. We have watched the midsummer bonfires rise against the summer sky and carried the ember home. And we have witnessed the disasters, the fires that consumed London Bridge, that burned Lübeck and Rouen and Utrecht, that erased in hours what had taken lifetimes to build. And we have watched the rebuilding, the return to the same streets, the new timber laid over the old ash, the first fire lit in the new hearth. I want to linger here in this last part of the night with something I mentioned briefly earlier and that I have been saving for this moment, because it sits at the center of everything. The need fire. In the early medieval period, across various parts of Northern Europe, there existed a practice, attested in church records, in condemnations by ecclesiastical authorities who considered it too old and too pagan, and in the folk traditions that survived their condemnations, of maintaining what was called the need fire. The name itself is worth pausing over. Not the want fire, not the useful fire, the need fire, a fire that was understood as something beyond practical function, beyond the daily requirements of cooking and warmth and light. A fire that was kept burning because its burning was needed in a way that went deeper than any specific use. In some traditions, the need fire was rekindled at the turning points of the year, at the great seasonal festivals, from a completely new flame. Every fire in the community was extinguished. Every hearth went cold. And from a new flame, made fresh, made from friction, made without carrying any inheritance from the fires that had come before, the need fire was lit. And from the need fire, every hearth in the community was relit. Every household carried away a coal from the central fire. Every home was reconnected to the shared source. The idea behind this is not difficult to understand, even at this distance. A fire that had been burning continuously absorbed, over time, the history of its burning, the accumulated grease of countless meals, the ash of many winters, the smoke of illness and grief and ordinary days. To renew the fire was to renew the household. To begin again from a clean source was to declare that the community was capable of beginning again, of letting go of what had passed and receiving what was new. The church authorities who wrote against the need fire did so because they recognized in it a competitor to their own theology of renewal. The Easter Vigil, with its extinguishing of all lights and its new fire and its paschal candle, was the Christian version of the same fundamental gesture. New fire from a clean source, the old darkness giving way. The community gathered around a single flame, each person carrying the light outward into the world. The need fire and the Easter vigil were not opposites. They were cousins, both reaching for the same thing in different languages. The idea that fire can begin again, that the household, the community, the self, can be renewed at the source. That however much has burned away, however much the ash has accumulated, there is always the possibility of a new flame. I want you to carry that with you. Not as a medieval belief, something historical and distant, as an idea that is still alive in the gesture, the candle we light for a birthday, the bonfire we build on a summer night and stand around together, the fireplace that still exists in some homes as something we light not because we need the warmth, but because a room with a fire in it is different from a room without one. We do not tend fires anymore in the medieval sense. We have freed ourselves from that particular form of daily labor, and I will not pretend that the freedom is not real and welcome. But something has gone quiet in the exchange. Something that the medieval person had and that we have had to find substitutes for in other ways. The daily relationship with something that required attention. The knowledge that the warmth in your life was not automatic, not guaranteed, not provided by infrastructure, invisible behind walls. The intimacy of knowing, in your hands and your breath, what the fire needed in order to survive. There is a kind of attention that the medieval hearth demanded from the people who tended it, a kind of present, embodied, unhurried attentiveness that is, I think, something we still hunger for, even when we cannot name it. The appeal of the open fire in the homes that still have them. The quality of an evening spent watching flames. The way a candle changes a room, not just visually but atmospherically. The way it makes people lower their voices and settle into themselves. These are echoes. Echoes of a relationship with fire that ran through the center of human life for so long that it has left an imprint in us that technology has not quite erased. We are the descendants of people for whom fire was everything. For whom a morning without the fire was a morning without the day. For whom the warmth of a room was not a setting on a thermostat, but a living presence, tended with care, watched through the night, coaxed back with patient hands each morning. That inheritance is in us even now. It is in the way a lit candle feels different from an overhead light. In the way a fire in a hearth draws people toward it, makes them want to sit nearby and not hurry away. In the particular peace of watching something burn. I think too about what it means to keep something alive through difficulty. The ember that had to survive the night. The fire that required tending, not once, not occasionally, but every single day, without exception. The person who woke in darkness and cold and did the work anyway, not because it was heroic, but because it was necessary. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Because a household without fire was not a household. There is a quality in that kind of sustained care that we recognize in other places in other contexts. In the care of children. In the care of the elderly. In the maintenance of any relationship or skill or practice that requires daily attention to stay alive. The medieval person tending the fire did not know they were doing something philosophically significant. They were keeping warm. They were making sure the bread could be baked. They were doing what the morning required. But in the doing of it, in the daily faithfulness of it, repeated across seasons and years and decades, they were also demonstrating something about what it means to care for something that matters. That it is not a single heroic act. It is 1,000 ordinary ones. It is showing up in the cold, before the light, and doing the work that no one will record, and no one will celebrate, and no one will even notice, because its success is measured only in the fact that nothing went wrong. The fire burned. The household was warm. The day began. That is the fullest picture I can give you of what fire meant in the medieval world. Not the dramatic fire of disaster or the holy fire of the cathedral, but the household fire, the daily fire, the fire that someone tended every day because the alternative was darkness and cold and the undoing of everything that had been built. That fire is the real story, and the people who tended it are its real keepers. What does it all add up to? I think it adds up to this. The medieval world was built around a relationship with fire that was so constant, so demanding, so central to every hour of every day, that it shaped not just how people lived, but how they thought about living. The hearth was not just a heating system. It was the center of the household in a way that nothing in most of our modern homes is. The place where food was made, and warmth was made, and light came from, and stories were told, and the dead were mourned, and the newborn were kept warm, and the evening prayers were said. The center, the axis, and tending it, the daily, nightly, unceasing, unglamorous work of keeping the fire, was not a burden layered on top of life. It was part of the substance of life itself, part of what it meant to have a home, and to maintain it, and to pass it on. The women who did most of this tending, whose names we do not know, whose skill is not in the records, whose morning labor with the bellows is visible only in the fact that the households they tended survived, those women were not performing a minor domestic chore. They were performing the foundational act of the household, the act before all other acts, the beginning from which everything else followed. And in the quietness of that labor, in its dailiness, its invisibility, its absolute necessity, there is something I find genuinely moving across the distance of all these centuries. Not because they suffered, though sometimes they did, but because they were competent, deeply, completely, bodily competent at something that mattered entirely. They knew the fire. They read its sounds in the night, and its warmth in the morning, and its color when it was burning well, and its different color when it needed attention. They knew what their hearth required, and they gave it. Day after day, winter after winter. In a world that did not write their names down, they kept the fire. There is a detail from the historical record that I want to close with. We know from household accounts and estate records, and the occasional window of documentation that opens onto ordinary medieval life, that a fire well maintained, properly banked at night, properly woken in the morning, properly fed through the day, could hold its embers alive across months of continuous use. The same fire, not relit from scratch, not reinvigorated from a neighbor's coal, simply tended, kept alive from day to day, from week to week, from the gray mornings of autumn through the bitter mornings of deep winter, carrying its heat forward without interruption. A fire old enough to have seen the seasons turn. I find that extraordinary. Not as a technical achievement, though it is one, but as an image of something essential about human life. The fire that survives because someone tended it. The warmth that continues because someone paid attention. The light that is still there in the morning because someone cared enough to make sure it was. You are lying in the warmth of your bed right now. The night has come all the way down around you. And somewhere in the long history of human warmth, somewhere in the centuries of banked hearths and careful breath and morning flames rising from darkness, there is a thread that reaches all the way to this moment. To you here warm. To the long, unbroken line of people who tended the fire so that the next morning would be possible. Who kept it burning so that the cold could be managed and the dark could be pushed back and the household could wake and the day could begin. That thread is in you. That inheritance is yours. The fire was tended. The night was survived. And here you are. Thank you for spending this night here with me. For letting the medieval world come close in the dark, and for following this quiet, essential story all the way through to its end. If tonight moved you, I hope you will find your way back to dreamy ages. There are always more hidden worlds waiting, and I will be here when you are ready for the next one. Sleep well.